Jake wiped the sweat from his forehead as he finished fixing the broken fence post. The Montana sun was getting lower, painting the sky orange and pink. He looked around his ranch and felt that familiar empty feeling in his chest. 3 years had passed since his father died, and Jake had been running this place all by himself. The ranch wasn't small. It had been in his family for 2 generations, with rolling hills covered in grass where cattle used to graze. Now most of the fields sat empty. Jake only kept a few dozen head of cattle because managing more alone was too much work. The house felt too big, too quiet. Every morning he woke up to silence, and every night he went to bed with only the sound of wind through the windows. At 32, Jake had given up on finding someone to share his life with. The nearest town was 40 minutes away, and everyone there had known him since he was a kid. The few single women his age had either moved to bigger cities or married someone else years ago. His mother called once a week from Phoenix, always asking if he was seeing anyone. He always said no, and she always sighed. Jake climbed into his old pickup truck and headed toward town. Tuesday meant grocery shopping and maybe a hot meal at Betty's Diner instead of another can of soup heated on his stove. The truck's radio played country music, but he turned it off. Even the songs about lonely cowboys reminded him too much of his own life. Betty's Diner sat on Main Street between the hardware store and the post office. It had red vinyl booths and a counter where old-timers drank coffee and talked about weather and politics. Jake usually sat in the corner booth, ate his meal, and left without talking to anyone except Betty, who always asked how he was doing. But today was different. Jake was halfway through his chicken and mashed potatoes when a man slid into the booth across from him. The stranger was maybe 40 years old, with dark hair slicked back and a nervous way of moving his hands. His clothes looked expensive but wrinkled like he'd been sleeping in them. "You're Jake Morrison, right?" the man said. His voice had a slight accent, maybe Louisiana or Mississippi. Jake nodded slowly. He didn't recognize this man, and strangers in their small town were unusual. "My name's Tommy Boudreau," the man continued. "I heard you got a big ranch out there all by yourself. What's it to you?" Jake asked. Something about Tommy made him uncomfortable. The man's eyes kept darting around the diner like he was watching for someone. Tommy leaned forward and lowered his voice. "I got a business proposition for you. Something that could help both of us out." Jake put down his fork. "I'm not buying anything." No, you got it backwards," Tommy said quickly. "I'm the one who needs help. See, I got myself into some trouble. Gambling trouble. The kind where bad things happen if you don't pay up fast." Jake started to stand. "I don't loan money to strangers." "Wait," Tommy grabbed his arm. "It's not money I'm after." "Well, not exactly. Look, I got someone that you might want." That's when Jake noticed the woman sitting 3 booths away. She looked young, maybe mid-20s, with long dark hair and skin that suggested Hispanic heritage. She was very pregnant, probably 7 or 8 months along. But what made Jake's stomach turn was the way she sat perfectly still, staring down at her hands, while bruises showed purple and yellow around her wrists. "That's my wife. Rosa," Tommy said, following Jake's gaze. "Pretty little thing, isn't she? Came up from Guatemala about 2 years ago. Doesn't speak much English, but she's a hard worker." Jake felt sick. "What are you getting at?" Tommy's voice dropped to a whisper. "I owe some very bad people $15,000. They want it by Friday or they're gonna hurt both of us. But Rosa, she's worth more than that to the right man, a man who needs a woman around his place." "You're talking about selling your wife?" Jake's voice was louder than he intended. A few people at other tables looked over. "Not selling," Tommy said quickly. "More like transferring responsibility. You pay my debts, she comes to live with you. Everybody wins." Jake looked at Rosa again. She hadn't moved, hadn't looked up, hadn't touched the cup of coffee sitting in front of her. She looked like a person who had given up hope. "This is insane," Jake said. "You can't sell a human being." "I'm not selling her," Tommy insisted. "I'm offering you a chance to help us both out. Look at her, man. You think she's safe with me? These guys I owe money to, they don't care that she's pregnant. They'll hurt her to get to me." Jake's hands were shaking. Every decent part of him wanted to walk away from this conversation. But he couldn't stop looking at Rosa, couldn't ignore the fear in her posture, couldn't pretend he didn't see the marks on her skin. "She needs a doctor," Tommy continued. "Good food, a safe place to have that baby. I can't give her any of that." "But you could, but why me?" Jake asked. "Because you're alone out there and she needs protection. Because you got money and land and a good reputation. Because maybe you're lonely enough to see this as an opportunity instead of just a problem. Jake felt anger rising in his chest. You think I'm desperate enough to buy a woman? I think you're decent enough to save one, Tommy shot back. Because if you don't help us, we're both gonna disappear by Friday. And I don't mean disappear to somewhere nice. Jake looked at Rosa one more time. As if she could feel his eyes on her, she looked up. For just a moment, their eyes met across the diner. In that brief second, Jake saw something that made his decision for him. It wasn't hope exactly, but it wasn't complete despair either. It was a tiny spark of fight still burning somewhere deep inside her. 15,000, Jake asked quietly. Tommy nodded eagerly. Cash, tonight, and Rosa comes with you right away. Jake pulled out his phone and checked his bank balance. The money was there barely. It was most of what he'd saved from 3 years of careful living and selling cattle. I want to talk to her first, Jake said. She doesn't speak much English. Tommy warned. Then you translate. They walked over to Rosa's booth. Up close, Jake could see she was even younger than he'd thought, maybe 23 or 24. Her pregnancy was advanced, her belly large under a faded blue dress. When Tommy spoke to her in rapid Spanish, she looked up at Jake with wide, dark eyes. Tommy turned back to Jake. I told her you might help us. She wants to know if you're a good man. Jake knelt down beside the booth so he was at Rosa's eye level. Tell her I won't hurt her, he said to Tommy. Tell her she'll be safe. After Tommy translated, Rosa studied Jake's face for a long moment. Then she nodded once, very slowly. Jake stood up, his decision made. Not because he wanted to buy a woman, but because he couldn't walk away from someone who needed help, even if it meant giving up most of his savings to a gambling addict. Even if it complicated his quiet, lonely life in ways he couldn't imagine. One condition, Jake said to Tommy. After tonight, you stay away. You don't come to my ranch, you don't contact her, you don't cause any more problems. This ends here. Tommy nodded so fast his head looked like it might fall off. Deal. Absolutely. You're saving both our lives here. But as Jake looked at Rosa's frightened face, he wondered if he was saving her life or just changing the nature of her problems. Either way, he couldn't leave her with a man who would sell his pregnant wife to pay gambling debts. The transaction would happen tonight. Jake's quiet life was about to change forever. Jake drove home that night with Rosa sitting quietly in the passenger seat of his pickup truck. The silence between them was heavy, filled with uncertainty and fear. Every few minutes he glanced over at her. She kept her hands folded over her pregnant belly, staring out the window at the dark Montana landscape rolling by. Tommy had taken the $15,000 and disappeared into the night like smoke. Jake had watched him count the bills twice before stuffing them into a worn leather jacket. The man hadn't even said goodbye to his wife. He just looked at Rosa once, muttered something in Spanish that made her flinch and walked away. Jake wondered if Rosa would ever see him again. Part of him hoped she wouldn't. When they reached the ranch, Jake pulled up to the main house and turned off the engine. The porch light cast a warm yellow glow across the front steps, but the house itself looked enormous and intimidating in the darkness. Rosa hadn't moved. This is home, Jake said gently, then realized she probably didn't understand. He tried to remember any Spanish words from high school, but his mind went blank. Rosa finally looked at him. Her dark eyes were filled with exhaustion and something that might have been gratitude, though Jake wasn't sure. She nodded and slowly opened the truck door. Jake hurried around to help her, but Rosa was already standing on her own. She was shorter than he'd realized, maybe 5 feet 4 inches. And the pregnancy made her movements careful and deliberate. She looked up at the house, then back at Jake, waiting for direction. Inside, Jake felt suddenly embarrassed by his bachelor lifestyle. Dirty dishes sat in the sink and newspapers were scattered across the coffee table. The house smelled like coffee and loneliness. He quickly gathered up the mess while Rosa stood in the doorway taking everything in. You must be tired, Jake said, speaking slowly and clearly. And hungry. Rosa tilted her head, understanding the tone, if not all the words. Jake opened the refrigerator and pointed to the food inside, then gestured toward his mouth. Rosa nodded and said something in Spanish that sounded like agree. Menti Jake made sandwiches while Rosa sat carefully at the kitchen table. He noticed she kept touching her belly, and once he saw her wince slightly. The baby was active tonight, probably sensing the stress and change. Jake wondered when the baby was due, how Rosa had been taking care of herself, whether she'd seen a doctor recently. As they ate, Jake tried basic communication. He pointed to himself and said Jake several times until Rosa repeated it with her soft accent. Then he pointed to her questioningly. "Rosa," she said, touching her chest. "Rosa," Jake repeated, and she smiled slightly. It was the first time he'd seen any expression other than fear or resignation on her face. After dinner, Jake faced the problem he'd been avoiding. Where would Rosa sleep? His father's old study had a fold-out couch, but it wasn't set up for a pregnant woman. His own bedroom was upstairs, but there was no way he was suggesting she share it, and the stairs might be difficult for her. Jake led Rosa to the study and opened the closet, pulling out sheets and blankets. Rosa understood immediately and began helping him make up the couch. Working together, even without words, felt surprisingly natural. When they finished, Rosa looked around the small room with its bookshelves and old desk, then looked at Jake with what he hoped was approval. "Bathroom," Jake said, leading her down the hall and pointing. "For you." He gestured vaguely at her condition, hoping she understood she could use it whenever needed. Rosa nodded, then surprised him by placing her hand on his arm. "Gracias," she said softly. "Thank you." Jake felt something tight in his chest loosen slightly. "You're safe here," he said, knowing she probably couldn't understand all the words, but hoping she could hear the sincerity in his voice. The next morning, Jake woke before dawn as usual, but he moved more quietly than normal. He didn't want to disturb Rosa, who was probably exhausted from everything that had happened. He made coffee and started breakfast, trying to be considerate of what a pregnant woman might need to eat. When Rosa appeared in the kitchen doorway, Jake was surprised by how different she looked. She'd found time to wash and braid her long hair, and though she wore the same blue dress from yesterday, she seemed more alert, more present. "Buenos dias," she said softly. Jake had looked that up on his phone while the coffee brewed. "Buenos dias, Rosa. How did you sleep?" She understood enough to smile and nod. Jake gestured to the table where he'd set out eggs, toast, and fresh fruit. Rosa's eyes widened slightly at the amount of food, and Jake wondered when she'd last had a proper meal. Over the next few days, they developed a routine. Jake would wake early and do the most urgent ranch work while Rosa slept. When she got up, they'd have breakfast together, then Jake would show her around the property. Rosa seemed fascinated by everything. The chickens, the few cattle, the vegetable garden that Jake's mother had planted years ago, but he'd never maintained. Communication slowly improved. Rosa had clearly studied some English before, and Jake downloaded a translation app on his phone. They learned each other's basic words and needs. Rosa taught Jake how to say good morning and please and careful in Spanish. Jake taught Rosa the names of ranch animals and tools. What amazed Jake most was how Rosa insisted on helping despite her pregnancy. She couldn't do heavy work, but she fed the chickens without being asked, started cleaning parts of the house that Jake had neglected, and even began trying to revive the vegetable garden. When Jake protested that she should rest, Rosa would pat her belly and say something in Spanish with a determined expression that clearly meant the baby was fine and she was capable of working. One afternoon, Jake found Rosa sitting on the porch steps writing in a small notebook. When she saw him, she closed it quickly, looking embarrassed. Jake held up his hands to show he wasn't trying to invade her privacy, but Rosa seemed to make a decision. She opened the notebook and showed him pages covered in neat handwriting. Spanish on one side, English translations on the other. She was teaching herself English by writing down everything Jake said and looking up words she didn't know. Jake was impressed by her determination and intelligence. He started speaking more slowly and clearly, helping her practice pronunciation when she asked. By the end of the first week, Jake realized something unexpected was happening. He was sleeping better than he had in months. The house felt alive again, filled with the sounds of another person moving around, humming softly in the kitchen, talking quietly to her unborn baby. The loneliness that had been eating at him for 3 years wasn't completely gone, but it was definitely smaller. Rosa seemed to be healing too. The fearful, resigned woman from the diner was being replaced by someone stronger. She still startled easily at loud noises, and Jake noticed she always positioned herself where she could see the exits in any room. But she was beginning to smile more often, especially when she caught Jake trying to pronounce Spanish words incorrectly. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Rosa placed her hand on her belly and looked at Jake seriously. "Baby coming soon," she said in careful English. Jake felt his heart skip. "How soon?" Rosa held up 2 fingers. 2 months. Maybe less? Jake realized he needed to find Rosa a doctor fast. But as he looked at her face in the golden evening light, he also realized something else. For the first time in years, he was taking care of someone other than himself, and it felt good. Rosa was changing his life in ways he hadn't expected. The ranch was becoming a home again. Jake woke up at 3 in the morning to the sound of Rosa crying out in pain. He jumped out of bed and ran downstairs, his heart pounding. Through the study door, he could see Rosa sitting on the edge of the fold-out bed, holding her belly with both hands. "Rosa, what's wrong?" he called softly, not wanting to startle her more than she already was. "Baby," she gasped in English, then continued in rapid Spanish that Jake couldn't follow. Jake's mind raced. It was too early. Rosa had said 2 months, maybe less, but this was only 3 weeks since she'd arrived. He grabbed his phone to call for an ambulance, but Rosa shook her head frantically. "No hospital," she said firmly. "No doctors." Jake stopped dialing. "Rosa, you need help." "The baby—" "No papers," Rosa said, touching her chest. "No, how you say—" "Documents?" Jake understood immediately. Rosa was afraid of being deported, afraid that going to a hospital would expose her immigration status. She was choosing to risk her life and her baby's life rather than face the possibility of being sent back to whatever she was running from in Guatemala. "Rosa, listen to me," Jake said, kneeling beside the bed. "I'll figure out the paperwork later. Right now you and the baby need medical care." But Rosa was shaking her head again, and Jake could see the terror in her eyes. It wasn't just fear of deportation. It was deeper than that, older. Someone had taught her not to trust authorities, not to seek help from official sources. The contraction passed, and Rosa relaxed slightly. Jake realized they might have some time. False labor was common, especially with stress, but as he watched Rosa's face, he knew this wasn't false labor. This baby was coming whether they were ready or not. "Okay," Jake said, making a decision that scared him. "No hospital, but I need to call someone who can help." Jake thought of Betty from the diner. Betty had 5 kids of her own and had helped deliver 3 grandchildren when doctors couldn't get there in time. She lived 20 minutes away, but she had a truck and wasn't afraid of driving in the dark. Rosa had another contraction while Jake was on the phone with Betty. This one was stronger, longer. Rosa gripped the bedsheets and tried not to scream. Jake felt completely helpless watching her pain. "Betty's coming," he told Rosa when the contraction ended. "She's delivered babies before. She'll help us." Rosa nodded, sweat beading on her forehead. "You stay?" she asked. "I'm not going anywhere," Jake promised. Betty arrived 40 minutes later with a bag full of towels, scissors, and other supplies Jake didn't want to think about too closely. She took one look at Rosa and immediately started giving orders. "Jake, boil water. Lots of it. And find every clean towel and sheet in this house," Betty commanded. "This baby isn't waiting for morning." The next 4 hours were the longest of Jake's life. He followed Betty's instructions, bringing supplies, holding Rosa's hand when she needed support, and trying to stay calm when everything inside him was panicking. Rosa was so young, so small, and this was happening too fast. Betty coached Rosa through each contraction in a mixture of English and the few Spanish words she knew. Rosa seemed to trust Betty instinctively, the way women have trusted other women through childbirth for thousands of years. "She's strong," Betty told Jake during a quiet moment. "Stronger than she looks. This baby wants to be born, and Rosa's doing everything right." Just as the sun was starting to rise, Rosa gave one final, enormous push, and suddenly there was a baby crying in Betty's hands. A tiny, perfect baby girl with dark hair and Rosa's nose. "She's beautiful," Betty said, placing the baby on Rosa's chest. "Small, but her lungs work just fine." Jake stared at the baby in amazement. He'd helped deliver calves and foals, but this was completely different. This was a human being, a brand new person who hadn't existed in the world 5 minutes ago. The baby's tiny fingers were curled into fists, and her eyes were squeezed shut against the bright morning light. Rosa was crying, but these were happy tears. She spoke to her doll, in soft Spanish, touching the baby's face with gentle fingers. Then she looked up at Jake with an expression he'd never seen before. Pure joy mixed with exhaustion and relief. "Thank you," Rosa said to both Jake and Betty. Thank you for saving us. Betty stayed for 2 more hours, making sure Rosa and the baby were both healthy and stable. She showed Jake how to help with feeding and changing, though she warned him that Rosa would need time to recover. This little one came early, but she's a fighter, Betty said as she packed up her supplies. Keep them both warm. Make sure Rosa eats good food and rests as much as possible. And Jake, you call me if anything seems wrong. Anything at all. After Betty left, the house seemed impossibly quiet. The baby was sleeping in Rosa's arms and Rosa was dozing fitfully. Jake sat in the old armchair his father used to read in, watching over them both. He thought about how much his life had changed in less than a month. 4 weeks ago, he was eating dinner alone every night, going to bed in an empty house, waking up with nothing to do but ranch work and his own thoughts. Now he was responsible for a woman and a newborn baby who depended on him for everything. The strange thing was, he didn't feel trapped or overwhelmed. He felt useful in a way he hadn't since his father died. Rosa and her daughter needed him, and he was capable of providing what they needed. It gave his life a purpose beyond just surviving day to day. Over the next few days, Jake learned how much work a newborn baby required. The little girl, who Rosa named Sophia, woke up every few hours wanting to eat. Rosa was tired and sore, but she insisted on taking care of Sophia herself as much as possible. Jake helped in small ways, bringing Rosa meals, doing extra laundry, holding Sophia while Rosa showered or napped. He was amazed by how tiny Sophia was, how her whole hand could wrap around just one of his fingers. When she cried, Jake felt an urgent need to fix whatever was wrong, though usually only Rosa could calm her down. She knows her mama's voice, Rosa explained one evening as she rocked Sophia to sleep. Babies, they know who keeps them safe. Jake understood that Rosa was talking about more than just Sophia recognizing her voice. She was talking about the bond between mother and child, the instinctive knowledge of who would protect and provide. It made him think about his own mother, how she must have felt holding him as a baby, how his father must have felt watching over both of them. One night, Jake woke up to silence instead of Sophia's crying. For a moment he panicked, thinking something was wrong, but when he crept downstairs to check, he found Rosa sitting in the rocking chair with Sophia in her arms, both of them sleeping peacefully. Rosa had wrapped Sophia in a soft yellow blanket that Jake's mother had made years ago for grandchildren she'd never had. In the moonlight streaming through the window, they looked like a painting, young mother and sleeping child, safe and protected. Jake realized he was looking at his family, not the family he'd imagined having someday, but the family that had found him when he needed it most. Rosa had saved him from loneliness just as much as he'd saved her from Tommy and his gambling debts. Standing there in the dark, watching over Rosa and Sophia, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in years. He felt like he belonged somewhere, like his life had meaning beyond just getting through each day. This was home now. These two people sleeping in his father's old chair, they were his to protect and care for. And somehow that felt exactly right. 3 months after Sophia was born, Jake noticed that Rosa had started looking over her shoulder again. The relaxed, peaceful woman who had been learning English and helping around the ranch was slowly being replaced by someone nervous and watchful. She would stop talking mid-sentence when she heard a car on the distant road, and she always kept Sophia close to her side. Jake didn't push her to explain. He'd learned that Rosa would share things when she was ready, not when he wanted answers. But he could see that something was weighing on her mind, something bigger than just adjusting to life with a new baby. One evening, while Sophia slept in her basket and Rosa folded tiny clothes at the kitchen table, she finally spoke up. "Jake," she said carefully, "I need to tell you something about why I came to America." Jake put down the ranch paperwork he'd been reviewing and gave her his full attention. "You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to." "But I do," Rosa said. "You have been so good to us. You deserve to know the truth." Rosa's English had improved dramatically over the months, though she still spoke slowly and carefully when discussing serious topics. She took a deep breath and began. "In Guatemala, I was married before Tommy, to a very bad man named Carlos. He was, how do you say, connected to dangerous people, drug people." Jake felt his stomach tighten, but he didn't interrupt. "Carlos, he hurt me many times, but I was afraid to leave because his family, they have power. They know police, they know judges. When I finally tried to run away, Carlos said he would find me anywhere I went. Rosa's hands were shaking slightly as she folded Sophia's tiny shirt. My grandmother, she was a very wise woman. Before she died, she gave me special things. Old coins from her family and jewelry that belonged to my great-grandmother. She said, "Keep these secret. Someday they will save your life." Jake leaned forward. "What kind of coins?" "Very old Spanish coins, and a necklace with emeralds that came from Colombia. My grandmother, she hid these things during the war. During bad times, she said they were worth much money, but only to the right people." Rosa reached under her shirt and pulled out a small leather pouch that hung around her neck. Jake had noticed it before, but had assumed it was just a religious pendant or something personal. When I finally escaped from Carlos, I came to America with nothing except these hidden treasures, but I was too scared to sell them. I thought if I tried, people would ask questions about where they came from. She opened the pouch and carefully poured the contents onto the kitchen table. Jake's eyes widened. There were 6 coins that looked ancient, with Spanish writing and dates from the 1700s. The necklace was simple but elegant, with 3 small emeralds set in old gold. "Tommy, he never knew about these," Rosa continued. "If he had known, he would have sold them for gambling money in one day. I kept them secret because I knew someday Sophia and I might need them to survive." Jake picked up one of the coins carefully. Even he could tell it was old and probably valuable. "Rosa, these could be worth a lot of money." "I know," she said, "but I was always too afraid. In Guatemala, if you have valuable things and no way to explain where they came from, bad people notice. Here, I don't know how to sell them without papers, without, what do you call it, documents that prove they belong to me." Jake understood her dilemma. Without proper documentation or legal status, Rosa couldn't easily convert her family treasures into money she could use, and she was right to be cautious. Valuable antiques and jewelry required paperwork that she didn't have. "There's something else," Rosa said, her voice getting smaller. "Last week when I went to town with you, I saw a man watching us at the grocery store. He looked like someone Carlos might send to find me." Jake's protective instincts immediately kicked in. "Are you sure?" "Not completely sure," Rosa admitted. "But he had tattoos on his neck, and he was asking the cashier questions about new people in town. When he saw me looking at him, he left quickly." Jake felt anger building in his chest. Rosa had been through enough. She deserved to live without fear, to raise her daughter in peace. "What do you need me to do?" Rosa looked surprised by his immediate offer to help. "I think maybe it's time to sell my grandmother's things. Sophia and we need to be able to leave quickly if Carlos finds us, and we need money to start new lives somewhere safe." "You're not going anywhere," Jake said firmly. "This is your home now." "Both of you," Rosa smiled sadly. "You are very kind, Jake, but you don't understand how dangerous Carlos can be. I cannot put you at risk because of my problems." "You're not putting me at risk," Jake said. "I'm choosing to help you." "There's a difference." Over the next few days, Jake did research on Rosa's coins and jewelry. He called an antique dealer in Billings who specialized in Spanish colonial artifacts. Without mentioning Rosa's name or specific location, Jake described the items and their general history. Spanish reals from the 1700s in good condition can be worth anywhere from $500 to $5,000 each, depending on rarity and condition, the dealer explained. And Colombian emeralds in authentic period settings, well, that could be quite valuable to the right collector. Jake also contacted a lawyer in Helena who handled immigration cases. He explained the situation in general terms: a woman with valuable family, heirlooms who needed to establish legal ownership and possibly convert them to cash. If the items have been in her family for generations, there are ways to establish provenance, the lawyer said. Family photographs, written histories, anything that documents the item's history can help establish legitimate ownership. When Jake shared what he'd learned, Rosa looked hopeful for the first time in weeks. "My grandmother, she wrote everything down," Rosa said excitedly. "She kept records of all the family treasures with dates and stories about where they came from. I memorized everything before I left Guatemala." "Can you write it down?" Jake asked. Rosa nodded. "I can write it in Spanish, and you see, and help me translate to English." They spent the next evening documenting everything Rosa remembered about her family's treasures. Her grandmother had been meticulous about recording the history of each piece. Which coin came from which ancestor, how the emerald necklace had been saved during various conflicts, why each item was important to their family's heritage. As Rosa told these stories, Jake realized he was learning about much more than valuable antiques. He was learning about Rosa's family, her culture, her ancestors who had survived wars and poverty and persecution. These weren't just valuable objects. They were pieces of history, connections to generations of strong women who had protected their families through impossible circumstances. "Your grandmother sounds like she was an amazing woman," Jake said as Rosa finished writing. "She was," Rosa agreed. She always said, "A woman must be like water, soft enough to nurture life, but strong enough to carve through stone." She taught me that survival sometimes means hiding your strength until you need it most. Jake looked at Rosa, holding Sophia while writing down her family's history, and he realized that Rosa had inherited more than just valuable coins and jewelry from her grandmother. She had inherited wisdom, strength, and the knowledge of how to protect what mattered most. The miracle wasn't just the hidden treasures Rosa had carried with her from Guatemala. The miracle was Rosa herself, a young woman who had survived violence, poverty, and fear while protecting both her unborn child and her family's legacy. Now it was time to help her use that legacy to build a secure future for Sophia, right here on the ranch that had become their home. The antique dealer in Billings called Jake back 2 weeks later with news that changed everything. After examining photos of Rosa's coins and jewelry, he'd contacted a collector in Denver who specialized in Spanish colonial artifacts. "Your friend's coins are extremely rare," the dealer explained over the phone. 3 of them are dated 1739, which makes them some of the earliest Spanish currency minted in the New World. The collector is offering $28,000 for the complete set. Jake nearly dropped the phone. $28,000? And that's just for the coins. The emerald necklace is even more interesting. Based on the craftsmanship and the quality of the stones, my contact believes it could be worth anywhere from $30,000 to $50,000 to the right buyer. When Jake shared the news with Rosa, she sat down heavily in the kitchen chair, Sophia sleeping in her arms. "That much money?" she whispered in disbelief. "Enough to secure your legal status, buy a house if you want one, and make sure Sophia has everything she needs for college someday," Jake said. Rosa was quiet for a long moment, staring at the small leather pouch on the table. "My grandmother always said these would save my life someday. I thought she meant I could sell them if I was starving. I never imagined—" Jake sat down across from her. "There's something else we need to talk about. The lawyer I contacted has been looking into your situation. There are programs for women who've escaped domestic violence, especially if they're willing to testify about criminal activity." Rosa's face went pale. "Testify against Carlos? The lawyer says if you can provide information about Carlos's drug connections, there might be a path to legal residency. It's not guaranteed, but it's possible." Rosa shook her head immediately. "Too dangerous. If Carlos finds out I talked to authorities—" "He's never going to find out," Jake said firmly. "Because you're not going to be Rosa from Guatemala anymore. You're going to be Rosa Morrison." Rosa looked at him in confusion. "Morrison?" Jake took a deep breath. He'd been thinking about this for weeks, but saying it out loud still felt scary. "I want you to marry me, Rosa. Not because you have to, not because you owe me anything, but because I love the life we've built together. I love coming home to you and Sophia. I love feeling like I have a family again." Rosa stared at him, Sophia making small sleeping sounds in her arms. "Jake, you don't have to—" "I'm not doing this because I have to," Jake interrupted. "I'm doing it because I want to. You and Sophia, you've made this house feel like home again. Before you came here, I was just existing, just getting through each day. Now I have a reason to wake up in the morning." Rosa's eyes filled with tears. "But marriage, it should be for love." "Real love? What do you think this is?" Jake asked gently. "Maybe it's not the kind of love that starts with romance and dates and flowers, but it's real. It's built on trust and respect and caring for each other. Isn't that love too?" Rosa was quiet for several minutes, looking down at Sophia's peaceful face. Finally she spoke. "In Guatemala, my grandmother told me that love grows in many different ways. Sometimes it starts like fire, burning bright and fast. Sometimes it starts like a seed, growing slowly and becoming strong." "Which kind do you think we have?" Jake asked. Rosa smiled through her tears. "The strong kind." They were married 3 months later at the courthouse in town, with Betty as their witness and Sophia gurgling happily in Rosa's arms. The ceremony was simple, but when Jake slipped the plain gold ring onto Rosa's finger, it felt like the most important moment of his life. The lawyer's prediction proved correct. With her new married name and Jake's support, Rosa was able to work with federal authorities to provide information about Carlos's criminal network. In exchange, she received legal residency status and a promise of protection. The coins and emerald necklace sold for even more than the initial estimate, $68,000 total. Rosa insisted on using part of the money to make improvements to the ranch, paying Jake back for his kindness and investment in their future. "This is our home now," she said as they planned a new barn and updates to the house. "I want to make it better, not just live here as your guest." With the financial security and legal protections in place, Rosa applied to have her teaching credentials recognized in Montana. She'd been an elementary school teacher in Guatemala, and the local school district was desperately in need of bilingual educators. 2 years after their courthouse wedding, Rosa stood in front of her own classroom for the first time in America. She taught second grade in both English and Spanish, helping immigrant children feel welcomed while teaching all her students about different cultures and languages. Jake expanded the ranch operation with Rosa's encouragement and financial contribution. They bought more cattle, fixed up the outbuildings, and even started a small vegetable garden that supplied the local farmers market. The ranch that had been slowly dying under Jake's lonely management became a thriving business supporting a growing family. Sophia grew into a happy, bilingual toddler who called Jake Papa and followed him around the ranch like a small shadow. She was fearless around the animals and loved helping with simple chores, chattering away in both English and Spanish as she worked. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching Sophia chase fireflies in the yard, Rosa leaned against Jake's shoulder. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Taking us in, changing your whole life?" Jake wrapped his arm around her. "Never. Do you regret letting me help?" "Never," Rosa echoed. "But sometimes I think about that night in the diner. What would have happened if you had just walked away?" Jake considered this. "I don't think I could have walked away. Some things are meant to happen. My grandmother used to say that miracles don't always look like miracles at first," Rosa said. "Sometimes they look like problems or challenges or scary changes." Jake looked out at their life, the ranch building silhouetted against the sunset. Sophia's laughter carrying on the evening breeze, Rosa's warm presence beside him. "What do you think the miracle was? The money from your grandmother's treasures?" Rosa shook her head. "The money was just money. The miracle was finding each other, finding a family neither of us expected." "And Sophia," Jake added, watching their daughter discover a toad near the garden. "Sophia was always a miracle," Rosa agreed. "But the bigger miracle was learning that love doesn't always start with romance. Sometimes it starts with one person seeing another person's need and deciding to help." As night fell and they called Sophia inside for her bath, Jake reflected on how completely his life had changed. 3 years ago, he'd been a lonely cowboy eating dinner alone every night, wondering if his life would ever be about more than just surviving. Now he was a husband and father, part of a family that had been formed not by blood or romance, but by choice and commitment and the daily decision to care for each other. Rosa had brought him more than companionship. She'd brought purpose, culture, laughter, and the joy of watching Sophia grow up bilingual and bicultural in the wide spaces of Montana. The miracle hiding in plain sight had been there all along. It wasn't the valuable coins or emerald necklace Rosa had carried from Guatemala. It was the capacity for broken people to heal each other, for strangers to become family, and for love to grow in the most unlikely circumstances. Jake had thought he was saving Rosa and Sophia that night in the diner, but they had saved him right back.